My name is Ari Redboard. Welcome to TRM Talks. TRM Talks is brought to you by TRM Labs, the leading provider of blockchain intelligence and anti-money laundering software. We have a truly extraordinary show for you today. I am joined by Alan Cohn from Steptoe & Johnson, John Rajewski from Stroh's Friedberg, and our very own Chris Hoffmeister from TRM Global Investigations to bring you into the war room, to show you where the magic happens in a true incident response scenario. So really, really excited to dig in with this team. A couple sort of quick housekeeping notes. One, we are wishing Jessica Peck well. She had an emergency this morning and is not able to attend from DOJ. I am hopeful that with my DOJ background and Chris from HSI and John in his work with FBI are able to sort of fill in the gaps of sort of where law enforcement gets involved. But we've already promised Jessica another opportunity to join TRM Talk. So excited to have her in the future. Please put questions in the Q&A. We will answer those as we go. That's why it's there, and sort of excited for you to engage in this. We want this to feel as much like you're with us in the war room as part of this incident response as possible. And finally, the handout tab hopefully is useful. Subscribe to the weekly roundup. It is the best source of crypto news every week, and stay tuned. And also the best way to get updated on our next TRM Talks. So thank you so much for joining us. And really, without further ado, before we dig in to this incident response, I would love our panel here to introduce themselves. So John, why don't I kick things off with you? Would you sort of just give a quick background so folks know who they're hearing from?
Sure. Thank you very much. So hello, everyone. My name is Jonathan Rajewski. I'm a practice leader of incident response here at Stroh's Friedberg. I'm a part of a group within Aon Cyber Solutions. We basically provide incident response globally. So my background is primarily in digital forensics and incident response. I've been doing it for just over 20 years now. I'm really looking forward to the discussion today because this is something that constantly is coming up with our clients.
Awesome. Alan.
Thanks, Harry, and great to be here. I'm Alan Cohn. I'm the co-chair of the blockchain and cryptocurrency practice at Steptoe & Johnson, law firm based in Washington, D.C. Been practicing in this space for about 7 years. Prior to Steptoe, I was at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security as an assistant secretary there with a variety of different responsibilities, including cyber and incident response at different times and places.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for joining, and just really excited to have your perspective as sort of move through that combo of sort of the practical piece, but also sort of the sound legal advice going forward, sort of what people are going to, what you're doing a lot of planning, right, in those initial moments. Really excited to hear from you there. And Chris, would love to hear about your background as well.
Yeah, sure. Ari, thanks for dragging me out of my my chair in global investigation here at TRM to do something fun like this. I'm really looking forward to it. So I joined TRM in February of this year. So that was like 10 years ago. Prior to that, I spent almost 13 years with Homeland Security Investigations as a criminal analyst. I helped open up what's called the National Bulk Cash Smuggling Center in Vermont in 2009. In the last few years I was up there, we kicked off a cryptocurrency intelligence program, and I spent several years doing a variety of investigations, but all of them involving cryptocurrency at some point. And prior to that, I was with U.S. Customs and Border Protection. I was an intel analyst with did a lot of counterterrorism work and cargo and conveyance security type of stuff. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you for letting us drag you out. I think for folks who have not met or heard from Chris are in for a treat. He's really one of the foremost experts anywhere on sort of how to respond to a crypto incident response. So yeah, thank you so much for joining us. So yeah, without further ado, let me tell you all a little bit about what you're going to be hearing about today. Who is the victim of the attack in our scenario? It is a fake, and I was told to say that. For anyone covering this story out there, it is a fake DeFi liquidity and yield protocol. They offer staking through their Wobble token and participation in governance with Gov tokens. They also maintain a reserve of stable coins for liquidity. So Wobblfi is a DeFi lending and staking protocol, essentially. Probably pretty familiar to folks who follow the DeFi space. So what happened to Wobblfi? So the hack that you're going to hear about today targeted a member of the development team and ultimately compromised the machine and was able to steal and gain access to private keys. The payload also picked up user credentials, giving the hacker access to an admin account for the Wobblefi Discord server. So we've talked about, and I think TRM has put out some information around sort of Discord server hacks. This is one of those as well. Once the hacker had the private keys, which had been used to deploy protocol contracts, the hacker updated the protocol contracts with versions that allowed them to control and transfer funds to their own wallet. Then they stole a bunch of Wobble tokens, as well as stablecoin reserves from the protocol. To add insult to injury, the hacker locked out the other Discord admins and posted a fake Wobblfi promotional link that duped users and stole another 10 million before people took note of the fraud. We are going to sort of dig into this hack for a moment. But Chris, before we do, I'm just going to ask you, what does all this mean? What exactly happened here? And what should folks be tracking?
Yeah, well, so I think there's a couple of storylines here. This is potentially a little more complex than the average attack that you see, right? So first of all, there was a there was a private key compromise, right? There was some sort of spear phishing attempt, and the attempt there is to get access to the control over the contracts, the control over the protocol by targeting a member of the team. The second part of that is this fraud campaign essentially that compromised the Wobblefi's Discord server, and that's a separate attack entirely with a separate set of typologies. But they're going after other victims, trying to capitalize on FOMO and the lure of some whatever promotional deal they put up on a fake website and got people to connect their wallets to.
That's perfect. And no, I really appreciate you sort of just giving us a quick overview of that. And I read it, quite frankly, in a shameless plug, because we are now a podcast on Apple and Spotify, and I couldn't just say, look at the slide anymore like I used to. So no, I really do appreciate that. Alan, how did you first get involved or engaged by Wobblfi?
Sure. So, it's different in the digital asset space, and particularly in the DeFi, Web3, decentralized asset space. We may or may not have been involved with this company prior to this hack, with this entity, with this platform, with this group of developers. In some instances, we may have been engaged at the outset as the development team was working on the platform before it went live. We may have been involved with the investors who recommended us to the development team. And if we were part of that process, if we were part of the process of thinking about conceptualizing the platform, conceptualizing its governance, conceptualizing its posture on different issues, then we may have been part of the advising on security policy code audits. We may have run through a basic tabletop exercise with the dev team, with the individuals who would have some responsibility if something went on like this, and we'd have understanding of kind of technically how the protocol worked, and some of the ways that operationally it was intended to interact with the larger ecosystem. We may have been brought in just to look at a particular issue, at a securities regulatory issue, at an issue involving anti-money laundering or economic sanctions, or any of the other regulatory issues that come up in this space. But it's not uncommon for us simply to be brought in, once something happens. And unlike in, kind of more traditional companies, oftentimes we're brought in on a narrow issue. What do we say? Or how do we deal with the FBI or another law enforcement agency, or law enforcement in another country, or different law enforcement agencies? And then our role kind of expands from there, as opposed to in the more traditional world where we might be working with a general counsel from the beginning, and taking on more of a holistic role from the start.
Terrific. Yeah, really, really helpful. In speaking to John earlier, he used this sort of analogy. You don't want to pick your team on game day. And I think that that's something that you're going to hear sort of throughout this conversation today. So Chris, to you now, and John, feel free to jump in here as well. I think Alan sort of got into the best case scenario a little bit here, right? They had some relationship with a lawyer or law firm that really understands this space. They hired they already brought on a blockchain intelligence solution, incident response function. What's the best case? Walk us through the best case scenario as we begin this response to the Wobblify attack.
Sure. Yeah. So, best case scenario, as Alan mentioned, is that, Wobblify engaged with the partners that they need to prepare for an attack before it happens. So, prior to the attack, Wobblify retained an incident response partner, such as us. That partner either has, blockchain, that has blockchain forensics, analytics capabilities to do tracing. And they either have, a digital forensics capability, or they have a partner that they bring in as well. So part of that, retainer, part of that engagement is that they've got an incident response plan that they've created ahead of time. As Alan mentioned, they've submitted their code to a third-party auditor. They've had testers look at their front end, their RPC endpoints. They've got and other Web 2 infrastructure they might use. They've evaluated their information security practices, and they've done full hypothetical tests of the contract outcomes, the financial outcomes of their protocol contracts. This is best case scenario.
And probably fair to say, and I think most DeFi protocols would agree, probably not the most likely scenario. It may be something more sort of what Alan mentioned, where like maybe they were retained for a very discrete, maybe regulatory question or law enforcement engagement, not necessarily like the full blown, what you'd see from a large corporation today in the cybersecurity space.
Yeah, for sure. You're going to see that like many projects will do, what they think is an adequate amount of work to prepare for, to secure their protocol essentially. But a lot of that is code focused. So you'll see that they do, most protocols will submit to a code audit, and then they'll even hang the code audit on their GitHub or on their website. To help, assure the community that they've been careful in designing their protocol. But there's so many other pieces to preparation for incident response that I don't think most projects approach holistically.
Great. Before we move to sort of the worst case scenario, which is usually more fun, right? One thing I've learned in this process from you guys really is that these sort of a tabletop exercise done well is sort of like a choose your own adventure. You're not entirely sure where you're going. But, as you move along, things are constantly changing. Best case scenario, worst case scenario. John, anything sort of to add from the sort of the non-crypto piece of that sort of best case scenario? How are companies either in the space or just generally engaging you in the right way?
Yeah, just to add to what Alan and Chris said, I mean, preparation is key, right? Like I mentioned on the call earlier, you don't want to pick your team on game day, and you want to make sure you trust your team, external and both internal. And we've talked about tabletops, but almost simulation as well, that it's fairly complex. Like actually run through a scenario like we're about to present or we're talking about today, and how would your team react? Who's responsible? What if that person's on PTO? Is outside counsel available? And involve them in that simulation so you truly can walk through the scenarios that maybe will present a risk to your organization. Ultimately, this is all about risk management. And if you can somehow, if you find yourself in an incident like this, what are the outcomes? You already kind of know what the outcomes are. I would also encourage companies to think about using their board as a part of this scenario as well, and all stakeholders that need to be there, because when it happens, it's usually a very driven by passion, by all that excitement and fear, because it is an incident. It does affect the business. It does affect customers and data. So when that happens, you want to be ready for it.
That's really helpful. All right, Chris, back to you. Wobblify is woefully unprepared. Okay. They've never talked to Alan. They've never talked to John. They've never engaged with a blockchain intelligence incident response team. Walk us through that.
Yeah, they're definitely woefully unprepared. This would be a completely uninteresting podcast. We'd be done in about 2 minutes.
Yes.
So we're looking at a scenario here where Wobblify is this tiny team of, anon devs. They're working async out of their homes. They don't have any insurance up front. They haven't engaged really competent counsel. There's no incident response plan. Importantly, they didn't bake in a kill switch to pause their contracts, to halt the activity, to halt the protocol in an expedient way when they do, find out that something's happening. They didn't take any defensive measures to minimize the damage. And so in fact, like worst case scenario, the contracts were deployed and updatable by this single compromised developer's private keys. So it's an absolute mess at this point.
Got it. Really helpful. We're going to jump from there in a moment, but John, I just want to go back to one thing that you said around insurance. I know that you are engaged oftentimes from an insurance angle. Just sort of quickly, what is that angle and why is it important in this scenario?
Yeah, so my team primarily responds to incidents, but we also have a part of our business within Aon Cyber Solutions that helps broker cyber insurance for many companies around the world. And during that process, there's typically an assessment, right? You're trying to understand what technical controls exist. Have you reduced risk in certain areas that insurance companies are looking specifically towards, and especially in this narrowly focused area, they may be looking at certain controls. We talked about the Discord server and compromising that, like ensuring that there's proper defense and depth measures that are created. So insurance does play a role in this. It also could help prepare a company to ensure they're ready for an incident response by demonstrating during the assessment, and even when you're dealing with conversations with insurance carriers, that you are ready and you do have controls in place and the risk is a certain level that is acceptable to.
That was really the point I was hoping to make, and I think Alan made it too. It's like companies will engage either you or Alan for different reasons. And one that makes a lot of sense is that they are looking for insurance and they need to prove certain things. It's like, I need to show, that I have sprinkler systems and an alarm system for my home insurance. This is really very much the same thing from a cybersecurity standpoint.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's getting, as you've seen in the last couple of years, we've seen certain types of attacks kind of continue to be more devastating, more costly. So the rigor is increasing. And it's almost like if you switch it from cyber to health insurance, right? If you can demonstrate you're healthy, maybe you'll get better coverage, right? It's the same idea. I'm not an insurance broker, full disclosure. But look, it's something where you need to be able to demonstrate it and kind of show that you do have competence in this area.
Terrific. So Wobblify is attacked. Kind of worst case scenario, don't really have the pieces in place here. Chris, obviously from the TRM standpoint, you start to try to understand where the fund's going. I'm going to pull up a few more slides here so you can kind of walk folks through these. What am I looking at right now?
Yeah. So what you're looking at right now is one of the first things that we would do as investigators is try and understand, some of the preparation for the attack. You're sort of following two channels of investigation right out the gate, like at 0 hour. Obviously, you're following the assets that were stolen. Like you want to find out immediately where they went. If you can trace those to any kind of partner in the space, any kind of VASP, virtual asset service provider that potentially has know your customer or some other kind of data that can either identify a suspect, provide evidence, facilitate possibly a law enforcement engagement down the road. Right here, though, what we're looking at is the preparation side of the attack. So we're looking at footprints that may have been left prior to the attack occurring. And in this case, so the wallet all the way on the right is the actual account that attacked Wobblefi and Solana. But we want to know,
just as we're just talking again, like so folks who are just listening. So what we're looking at here is sort of the initial hack funding, sort of what happened out of the gate. Right. Sorry to interrupt. So start and what we have is essentially a TRM graph on this. So we're looking at funds moving from left to right, essentially. Yeah, depending on where you're sitting. Yes. All right, go. I'm sorry.
Yeah, for sure. And so what we do is we trace backwards essentially. And what we want to find out is how are the fees paid for example, for the transactions that were executed to attack the protocol. We're going to look at where those initial, funds came from. Did they use a flash loan? How did they fund that flash loan? How did they get that liquidity to attack the protocol? How did they fund the wallets that ultimately would receive stolen assets? If you're on a blockchain like Ethereum, for example, you have to pay the fees for transactions in Ether. But if you steal a bunch of stable coins, you steal a bunch of other tokens, and you don't have any Ether, transfer them anywhere. So somewhere someone is paying for these transaction fees, and that's what we do for. We look backwards before the attack. What other wallets were set up? How did they get the funds there? Did they try and obfuscate the trail? In this case, they did. And so we're looking at, tracing backwards one step. We see that there was a nested exchange that was used to move funds from the hacker's Ethereum wallet, which is the red one sort of in the middle, over to the hacker's Solana wallet.
Cool. And just for folks who are listening, and I know this is a pretty sophisticated audience, but a nested exchange is essentially an entity that is using the infrastructure of likely a larger exchange for purposes of sort of liquidity and potentially obfuscation. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's a fair definition. So while it will look on its face to us, tracing on the blockchain that it may be a larger exchange, in reality, it's the smaller nested exchange that's riding that infrastructure. And so there are questions there about how you investigate that and how what kind of data you can get out of the larger exchange versus the nested one. Before that, we see that funds, they used a mixer to try and obfuscate the trail of the Ethereum funds, and then they've got some exposure early on to an exchange, a named exchange, through sort of a secondary wallet that paid for some gas, some fees, as well as like a staking service. And then early on, it looks like some of the funds were actually bridged over originally from Solana as well. So
terrific. Yeah, no. And there's a question on here. So what is the relevancy? I think you've sort of gotten to this, but just to sum it up, what is the relevancy of the two attack techniques to bridge hacks? Anything to add on that?
The relevance of the two techniques to bridge hacks. Bridge hacks have their own sort of quality, like the way that people attack bridges is different in some ways to the way that like Wobblify may have been compromised. This was a private key compromise, so they're basically just ripping the funds using the right credentials. Bridge attacks will often attack some sort of contract code exploit to try and pull some of the locked liquidity out of the bridge. In many cases, if it's a bridge where it's like a lock and burn type of bridge.
Cool. And before we move on, I pulled up another. This maybe goes to this question a little bit too. I just pulled up another graph in TRM that shows the Wobblify hack and bridge piece as we sort of move on. Would you talk through this a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So what we see is sort of on the left, we have a lot of funds that came out of Wobblify to the hackers' wallets. After they compromised the keys, they walked with a bunch of assets. At that point, they swapped most of those assets using a decentralized exchange on Solana. They stole a bunch of assets from Wobblify, a bunch of Wobble tokens and some other governance tokens, and they swapped those to turn them into stable coins, both to sort of retain value depending on how long they had to hold on to those after the hack, to sort of let their wallets cool off from the heat, so to say. And then once they, did that, they left that blockchain. They bridged it over to Ethereum, put it in a new wallet. And then once they got over there, they swapped some of those stable coins for Ether.
Terrific. I just real quickly, Tom, who is an excellent tracer himself, sort of points out that it's even harder to do tracing via podcast than it is using an Explorer or other tool. Would you just sort of summarize, as you're one thing I think you're very, very good at is really trying to understand sort of what the threat actor is doing and thinking. When you sort of combine these two slides, what is this individual obviously perpetrated a hack and then it starts to move funds. What is he thinking? Obviously he or she thinking there's obviously an obfuscation piece to this with mixers involved. What's going on here?
Yeah. So, when I was with HSI, a lot of what I did is I talked to special agents who investigated this stuff. And I always used to tell them the same thing. While we're looking at hashes and, addresses on blockchain ledgers, behind all of these transactions is a person, and they're acting intentionally and they're behaving like a person. So, while there is some like programmatic money laundering, things like that out there that you can, see on the blockchain, for the most part, these are bad actors who are doing things that logically someone who's committing a crime is going to do, right? They're going to hide their money. They're going to switch their getaway car. Right? They're going to jump from one blockchain to another blockchain so that, it looks different. They're going to, dive through the mall, run through the store, go out the back door, use a mixer. Like they're going to do all the things that, a rational bad actor would do to try and cover their tracks, because eventually the ultimate goal is to get the funds to a place where they can convince someone they're paying or someone who's helping them cash them out that those funds come from a legitimate source.
Really, really helpful. Thank you so much. And we'll get back more into tracing in a moment. My next question is sort of, the law enforcement piece. When does law enforcement get involved, and how does law enforcement get involved? It was interesting. We were prepping for this admittedly the other day, and I asked Jessica just this question, and her answer was essentially as early as possible. And she's part of the National Cryptocurrency Enforcement Team within DOJ. And quite frankly, I was surprised about just how early they're getting involved in these types of cases, maybe direct from the victim. Or, obviously when you bring someone like Alan or a law firm involved, maybe they can facilitate that conversation, or a incident response function as well as sort of part of that. But it's sort of interesting, having been a prosecutor, at DOJ for about 11 years, you think of sort of cases coming from agents or from sort of the law enforcement side. But a lot of what we're hearing now is that DOJ is hearing directly from victims. Chris and John, sort of just like from your experiences, and Alan too, feel free to chime in. How are you seeing law enforcement first get involved in a Wobblfi-esque exploit?
Yeah, I can chime in really quick. I like to look at these investigations like it's in a big Olympic-sized pool with multiple swim lanes, right? Law enforcement is definitely in one of those swim lanes, swimming towards the end of that pool, which is let's figure out what happened. And law enforcement has powers that civilians do not, right? They can trace things, that they can get the data that allows them to have better visibility into what happened, which person maybe was it, or which account was it. And I would advise a client to contact law enforcement when a crime is committed. Typically, I'm working with outside counsel who would direct the client or talk to the client specifically, and Alan can talk more into that, because usually what I'm doing is I'm working under legal privilege with that client to try to help them through this incident. But law enforcement is very much a part of the puzzle, and a lot of them are very, like I mentioned, they have powers that others do not, that they can help investigate and hopefully try to get some of this funding back before it moves too far.
Really helpful. Does anyone else have anything to add on sort of the law enforcement piece?
Yeah, just to second everything that John said. Victims are limited in their options, right? At some point, assets leave on the blockchain. They're immutable. They go. You can't revert them. So you're stuck, right? Like you either need law enforcement to come in with their additional powers to be able to uncover that data, to identify a suspect, to collect evidence, potentially prosecute, potentially get an arrest. Execute seizures, forfeitures, so they can get funds back. Ultimately, you want your money back, right? If you're Wobblfi, you're gutted, your protocol is dead, it's lying on the floor, like bleeding out. Like incident response is about stopping the bleeding and resuscitating Wobblfi. And in order to do that, you need to get those assets back. So those options are limited. There are civil processes that there's potential there. There are criminal processes with law enforcement. Or you have the third option, which is, you try and go it alone and, potentially negotiate a bounty, a return of some funds. And that has its own hangups as well.
It's useful to think about also, again, this is where things diverge a bit from the traditional world. In some of the most well-known hacks of large companies, their technical teams are alerting their management, their counsel's office, their outside counsels, gathering their incident response team. As Jonathan said, that the team's working under privilege, activities, response activities, tracing, public messaging. It's all being coordinated centrally. This, our industry, the digital asset industry, works differently, and that's not necessarily how law enforcement's going to get involved here. The NCET at DOJ, the law enforcement agencies, they follow crypto Twitter just like the rest of us do. Everything that's going on that Chris described in terms of the hack of a DeFi protocol, people can see, people are looking for, people are talking about. People are alerting one another in real time on social media. And it's not necessarily a message that, number one, it's not necessarily a message that an entity can control. But number two, it is potentially a route by which law enforcement gets notified or made aware of an incident. And they may be initiating contact or looking to initiate contact before an entity can kind of get its ducks in a row, its team assembled, and its processes set forth. So it can go from the traditional way of a company reaching out through counsel based on its the activity of its team, or it can be in real time based on what law enforcement is seeing, just like the rest of us do, by following social media and other developments in the area.
Super helpful, and actually like a perfect place. Let me stay with you on like a whole range of these topics, and Chris and John, feel free to jump in here. I do want to talk about sort of crypto Twitter and sort of the role it plays in this scenario, because I think it's really, really interesting and important. And there's also a great question on crisis comms that, Alan, I would love you to sort of address here too. But look, what we're doing here is, what we've seen here is there's this attack. You have a, TRM is engaged from an incident response standpoint. Chris is tracing. John is sort of working to investigate the sort of off-chain incident piece, sort of, potentially who was behind this, what happened here. What are you doing with vis-a-vis a client when things start to heat up? And feel free to get into any of those areas you've already mentioned.
So look, ideally, Wobblify has engaged us from the outset and given us a mandate to say, look, either gather this team, or this is our team, work with our team. And we're able to say, okay, look, we're going to work in a synchronized manner. We're going to arrange engagements in ways that protect privilege and that allow the team to work together. But that may be something that we're able to do on the outset. That may be something that we're playing a little bit of catch up on and assembling as we go. We're always advising, our clients to lean forward and be proactive when it comes to engagement with law enforcement agencies, with incident response partners, and with other agencies, with other entities that may be impacted and that may show up along the transaction tracing line, like Chris was describing. So engagement with other entities, particularly VASPs, stablecoin companies, others like that, as well as with law enforcement, can often kind of be most effectively done through counsel. A lot of those entities have general counsels, have counsel's offices. They're used to working with entities, and engaging with law enforcement is also something that can be tricky. That can be very unknown territory for entities, and so we can be very helpful in kind of helping to coordinate the message, especially because some of it's going to be, as we said, on-chain, where we're trying to share information with law enforcement so that they can use their tools that were described. Sometimes that's Jonathan and working with off-chain kind of activities, more traditional type of activities, and we can be helpful in facilitating that. Again, counsel can play that kind of coordinating role that's effective for a number of reasons. Number one, again, we're used to working with all the partners. Number two, there's a lot of pieces, as Jonathan said, it's a lot of swim lanes to coordinate. And number three, there are issues of privilege and coordination and messaging.
Cool. Alan, I'm going to come back to you in a bit. Just I want to sort of really get into some of the legal issues that you're thinking about throughout the course of this. Chris, Alan mentioned crypto Twitter, and it's just such an interesting aspect to me of all of this because it's the first time ever where anyone can follow the flow of funds in these ways. You do not necessarily need sophisticated blockchain intelligence tools. You can use Etherscan, block explorers, etc. How does crypto Twitter sort of play a role in an incident response like this?
Yeah, that's a super interesting question. It plays a number of roles, but I think the most important one that Alan brought up is that all of this stuff happens publicly, and it's very much being watched by people in crypto, and definitely, when it comes to the war room, right? Like you're standing up a war room, you've got your team together. Wobify stood up its war room. We, counsel's in there, investigators like me are in there, John's in there. You have people, technical leads from the protocol. Everybody's talking, trying to coordinate leads. I've often seen like you have multiple war rooms that happen, right? So like you have the official one, right? That's Wobify's running internally. And then you end up having like these ad hoc war rooms that stand up, right? Like, so Wobify, this happens to Wobify. And pretty soon afterwards, one of Wobify's, close partners in the space, another protocol, or somebody from another dev team, stands up a Telegram group and invites, Wobify, the guys from, Solscan and Solana and any other protocols that may have popped up in the on-chain tracing, because, this happens. And then, everybody's an on-chain sleuth now, right? So I see everybody's got leads. And so there's this second war room where a bunch of, often very talented people, very knowledgeable, are throwing information into this like second public war room, right? Public private sort of. And then, you have this sort of third space of the community for the protocol itself. So often that's the Discord server for that. So Wobify's Discord server is going to explode, and everybody who held Wobble tokens and staked liquidity and had governance tokens and invested in Wobify, everybody's doing their own investigation, and they're pulling in information from crypto Twitter, and they're throwing leads in there, and people are speculating. They're trying to dox people they think they've found on the blockchain and tied to some old NFT purchase, or so there's this mad dash to solve the crime. And part of the incident response team's responsibility is to follow all this, but also to triage the information.
Yeah,
side.
It's a really good point because it's usually it's very, very solid. It's very, very accurate oftentimes, but there's so much happening, and you really have to, that triage process I think is really interesting. John, one of the things that's going on very possibly is some sort of negotiation with the hacker or hackers. And it could take a couple of different forms. My guess is that in a Wobblefy scenario, it involves a bounty potentially of some kind. There are other scenarios where there could be valuable information that has been stolen and that the victim wants back. But sort of however you want to sort of answer this, but what does that conversation look like, or how does that usually take place?
Right. So when you're negotiating with a threat actor, if we just speak generally, it is a high risk situation. It's a high risk maneuver. You're talking with someone who you don't know who they are, you don't know where they are in the world. For example, if that threat actor is currently sitting in a country that is sanctioned by the United States, I'm not a lawyer, but I've read the releases from the Department of Treasury and FinCEN, and when it comes to OFAC sanctions and things like that, it is a very dangerous and high risk situation for that client or for that victim, right? I would advise a client to seek out legal guidance before thinking about making any payment to a threat actor. And it is a high, it's the best way to describe it, is a high risk maneuver. It is not at all a quick thing. It may take weeks, it may take days to actually get in touch with someone, to have that negotiation, and even the payment process may take weeks or days because of the way compliance has to happen to make sure that who you're paying, you actually know who you're paying in some way. It is never something that is an easy thing to do, and it should be done in a very careful, methodical, advised, and you're being advised by the experts who can actually help you make a good decision for your company.
Cool. Alan, I'd love to hear you on this. And just to be clear, what one of the real problems that John is talking about here is the possibility of a victim paying a sanctioned actor and therefore violating OFAC sanctions in the course of trying to pay a ransom. So you want to really understand, am I engaging with a sanctioned entity? How do you sort of advise a client under this scenario, Alan?
So, so yes, to echo what's been said, this is a tricky area, and it's an area where you quickly find yourself in a gray zone of trying to feel your way through the process. But it is first and foremost kind of it consists of a couple of pieces. Number one, kind of what tools you have at your disposal, and whether you need more to, again, understand who it is you're dealing with from an identity perspective, if you can, from a wallet perspective, that's going to give you more information about who you're potentially dealing with, and what obligations that you may have. Second, it's another reason why that proactive engagement with law enforcement is so important. If you're engaging with law enforcement and you're discovering this as you go, and you're sharing this information, you're in a much better position to figure out, exactly how to proceed in a way that gives you some legal protection, better chances of recovering the funds, and also a better ability to assist law enforcement in their activities. So if they know what you are doing, if they can see what you are doing, you're in a much better position. You have the opportunity to engage with offices like the Office of Foreign Asset Control at Treasury, which administers the sanctions programs, to look at the potential for obtaining a license for a payment that you may want to make, knowing that law enforcement is going to be able to watch that payment, see what happens, see where it goes. And then third is you need to be thinking about, again, these are multi-jurisdictional issues. The U.S. is not the only entity that's involved, and so you want to be thinking about the different, to the extent that it may come back that these actors are under scrutiny of one type or another from a variety of different law enforcement agencies, and you want to make sure that you are coordinating to the best ability that you can as you're trying to carry out these negotiations, as you're trying to figure out whether you should pay these actors, whether you can pay these actors, how to pay the actors, and how to do it in a way that's coordinated with the relevant authorities.
Awesome. Question for all of you. There was a good question in the Q&A. Something I wanted to get to is crisis comms. Oftentimes, I think obviously a lot of things happen in the crypto space on Twitter, and there is a real desire to get out a message to users as quickly as possible. And Chris mentioned sort of Discord blowing up. Just there's a lot of hunger and need for information quickly these days. So if you're a sophisticated, development team, GC at Wobblfi, how should you be thinking about crisis comms? What should you be putting out? When should you be putting out? Feel free, anyone jump off. Chris, if you want to lead us off.
Yeah. So I think it's important, particularly in this space, the communities are so engaged with these protocols so closely that, crisis comms really are such a key part of like maintaining the community trust and the reputation of, Wobblfi, right? Comms should be frequent, transparent, and clear. And they should go across channels, right? So you got your crypto Twitter posting, you should be talking, your Discord admin should be posting there, Telegram groups, your website should be updated. If you've got like a Medium blog or something, like that's where you put the updates of the investigation to the extent that you can. Obviously that has to be coordinated, particularly if you've engaged with law enforcement, what you say, you have to take care with what you say and how you say it and what you disclose. But all of these things, I think that it's important to note that all of these different pieces are also like so interlocked, right? The crisis comms, the bounty negotiation, your engagement with law enforcement, the privilege conversations you're having, all those things are tied together. Like while you're saying something on crypto Twitter, the guy that stole everything is listening to your on-chain messages via, an Etherscan, message, right? Like, if you send them a transaction with some input data, right? Like they're reading that, so is everyone else. And importantly, if you do engage with them, your conversations, how you talk to them and what you say to them and what they say to you, all of that is potentially evidence in a law enforcement investigation as well.
Really helpful. Other things to add to the crisis comms piece?
I would add, in addition to all the things that Chris said, your communications have to be factual. You can't get ahead of what you know, and you can't obfuscate or do things that later on maybe shown not to have been true. I think one of the key rules of crisis communication is, if you find yourself in a hole, stop digging, among a variety of others. But from a legal perspective, you don't want to be doing something in the middle of an incident like this that's going to come back later as an allegation that you were being untruthful with your community, you were being fraudulent with the community, you were misleading the community. It's very difficult because you're not in these situations. You're not going to have all the facts. The facts are going to be changing. The situation's going to be changing. As Chris said, there's going to be a lot of different dynamics at play when you're dealing with law enforcement, when you're dealing with potentially dealing with hackers. But you don't want to create additional problems, legal issues for yourself, in addition to what the entity may be facing once kind of the immediacy of the incident has passed.
Yeah, love it. And love a good transition. This is great. So as you guys are all worried about crypto Twitter, the funds are still moving. So Chris, we're going to do a little bit more tracing, sort of show folks, our best estimate of how funds would actually move in this case. So we talked about the sort of the last movement of funds here. Let's talk about sort of what happens next. And if you would sort of walk us through sort of the left of boom, right of boom scenario, and what that even means.
Yeah. So left of boom, right of boom is it's a military term. And it's not used quite the same in this sense, but it's what happens after an attack takes place and what happens before an attack takes place. So before is left, after is right. Right. So right of boom, we're tracing funds to figure out where they went and what happened to them after they were stolen. Left of boom, much like, we started with that initial look at how the preparations were made for the attack. Left of boom is where we're looking for footprints that the target may have left anywhere on the blockchain. As we all know, crypto and blockchains are forever. So, the potential for somebody to have made a mistake leading up to this attack on Wobblfi is there. And if we look at this graph, we look back, we look at the exposure of the initial Ethereum wallet that funded the attack, which is there sort of on the right-ish part of the graph. So if you can imagine, the attack is like the right-hand side of this just off the right-hand side of this slide. But if we look back, again, like we saw before, there was some exposure to a staking service on Ethereum from one of these early wallets. There was early exposure to an exchange from a secondary wallet that paid for some of the gas funding that funded some of the wallets to in preparation for the attack. There was a bridge coming over from Solana. We can trace back through that bridge transaction. Potentially there's some exposure to services on Solana. Maybe they bought NFTs. Maybe they used a lending protocol at some point. Who knows?
And another shameless plug, because I'm not above them, but like last week, Jennifer Vanderveer from the former FBI, now TRM, came and talked about just this: how to trace funds across blockchains, how to trace funds across bridges, the use of bridges, attacks on bridges. So very cool one that's still sort of out there on various channels. Worth checking out. A really nice, I think, sort of corollary to what we're talking about today.
Yeah, 100%. Jennifer's talk was great. And it's so important because I have to, like, frankly, very few of the cases that I catch here with global investigations do not involve some kind of cross-chain swap, some bridging activity. It is so common now for assets to move across blockchains in just about every scenario. But, so, when we look back, though, we look at some of these early transactions prior to the attack. There's some exposure from these early wallets. There's some commingled funds from a secondary wallet that has a lot of exchange exposure. These are all potential leads for us as investigators to reach out to see if there's a workable lead there by reaching out to, like, our partners in the investigative teams at these exchanges. And also for law enforcement. These are places where they can serve subpoenas and hopefully get some data to boost to boost their investigation.
Cool. So what happened before now, right of boom is sort of what happens after the attack. We're looking at a graph here from TRM that talks about sort of Wobblfi hack right of boom.
Yep. Right. So, the hacker, attacked Wobblfi and Solana, bridged the funds over, swapped some for stable, bridged it over to Ethereum as a USD coin. And then swap that for DAI, and then kind of sat on the DAI for a while. At this point, this graph is like a hypothetical scenario that the protocol has decided to try and negotiate, some kind of bounty. And in this scenario, we have a couple of Wobblefi wallets that are in green, where for example, all the way on the left, Wobblefi paid a little money to send a message on Ethereum to the hacker. Thanks for ruining Wobblefi. You've made so many people's lives, worse by your actions. Send an email to this address and let's start talking. And then, in the course of the bounty negotiations, some progress was made. And you've got some funds that were not bridged over on Solana that were paid back to Wobify at one of their Solana accounts, and that's up at the top. And then at the bottom, after they've made a so-called proof of life transaction from the account, during the course of the investigation, the negotiation with the hacker, you have to verify that the person you're talking to is also in control of the funds. So often that's a proof of life transaction where you say, this afternoon, send us like a tiny amount of ether from this account, so that we know that, like, you're the guy I'm talking to, and you can actually transfer funds.
Awesome, John. There's a lot of stuff happening on chain. What does an incident response look like from an investigative standpoint? What are you doing to figure out sort of who is the hacker? What happened here? What was the infrastructure in place? Walk us through a little bit of that.
Yeah, I can touch on this really quick, but it is a very, another hour type conversation. Yeah. But like I mentioned, the swim lanes, like this tracing is critical to what's going on, but we also need to, in very early hours of this investigation, is collect as much information as we can. Was this an insider? Was it an external person? And that's going to involve conversations with the technical team to understand the actual technical infrastructure, how data comes in, how data comes out, how the protocol is interacting with internal, external systems, to make sure that we have enough information. So when Alan has questions for us in 2 to 3 weeks from now, we know what happened, but how did it happen? We opened this tabletop telling you how it happened. But the reality is that investigation may take days or weeks. And that's a normal pace because we're looking at data. Data takes time to transfer. We have to analyze it. And there's a lot of emotion going on during the incident. So just be prepared. If you're preparing for an incident right now, make sure that you have the right people on call that can answer these questions so we can collect the evidence that we need to answer the questions that we're going to have to answer in the coming days.
John, that was an amazing answer. And I think you may have answered 3 questions in the chat all at one time. That was awesome. I'm going to end with Chris on sort of how this thing ends or how the scenarios. But before I do, Alan, as quickly as possible, just because we never have enough time on TRM Talks, there are some legal issues that are starting to play out here. And there are legal issues that may be long-term issues for the company. And how are you thinking about those as you sort of advise Wobblify?
Yeah, it's important just to remember that the Department of Justice and law enforcement agencies are not the only government agencies that Wobblify is likely to have to interact with over time. You have to be anticipating seeing the SEC, the CFTC, FinCEN, OFAC, others. That's not so different from traditional breach response, where the Federal Trade Commission or state regulatory agencies may pop their heads in. But you have to be thinking from the outset. Number one, we have to effectively respond to this incident. But number two, our actions are going to be scrutinized later, and they're going to be scrutinized through the lens of the regulatory regimes in place. And so, questions are going to, the client, the platform, Wobblify has to be ready, to respond to and to describe its compliance processes and programs, its messaging to date. And in particular, there is some tension between the way that the SEC views things like the value of decentralization versus things in incident response, like the ability for a group of individuals or an entity to swiftly step in and take definitive actions, whether that's through kill switches or through transaction reversals or through things, where there are things like stable coins in place where we can freeze transactions in conjunction with those entities that run counter to that. So we are advising Wobblify along those lines at the same time that we are advising them to first and foremost effectively and adequately address the hack, protect the platform, protect the entity, protect the users, try to recover the funds.
Really helpful. Next time I'm going to have you on to talk about whether or not a Wobble token is a security under the Howey test, but we'll do that, and we'll do that next time. Chris, take us home here, sort of, quick as you can. Again, we're running out of time, but best case and worst case scenario for sort of the way something like this ends.
Yeah, for sure. So like best case scenario, within a couple of days, the contract code is all updated, re-audited, the protocol reserves are replenished, users are made whole through insurance payouts. Keep in mind that the best case scenario is, one in which there wasn't much damage, right? Within a couple of weeks, community trust is super high. The protocol is operating normally. Off-chain investigation is progressing. The left of boom analysis identified some on and off-chain evidence. And eventually, bounty negotiations, other asset recovery efforts claw back most of the losses. And due to its incident response preparation, Wobblify is now less vulnerable and a less appealing target for future hackers. Worst case scenario, days go by without any real action on the part of Wobblify because they're not prepared at all. The assets are laundered a few times using different methods, some bridging, some swaps, some mixers, decentralized assets. The trail is getting cold. Tracing and attribution is getting difficult. The hacker's smart, knows how blockchain forensics work, has been careful to cover their tracks. The hackers made no obvious mistakes. And because the on-chain investigation is more complex, opportunities for attribution are slim. The team is having trouble getting buy-in from law enforcement. Wobblify's counsel is kind of inexperienced, before engaging with Alan. And so options for civil suit, negotiation, law enforcement engagement aren't really being explored. The community is screaming. Some are accusing the dev team of an exit scam or, alleging an inside job. Wobblify's reputation is in tatters. And because of all these factors, the chance of negotiating a bounty with the hackers is super low because there's no real leverage. And the appeals to the hacker for some kind of responsible disclosure type of solution are falling on deaf ears. So, and at this point, investors are walking away.
Yeah. No, really helpful. Probably the scenario is somewhere in between these two for many of these types of cases from my experience. But no, thank you so much for that. And we could do another hour on this or another. Honestly, this is like the whole idea is like, can we condense some sort of tabletop exercise into an hour? And really appreciate you, John, Alan, Chris, doing that for us today. And thank you to the audience, and thank you for the awesome questions. Hopefully we got to most of them. I don't think all of them, but feel free to hit us up if we didn't get to your question. Thank you for joining TRM Talks. We have an unbelievable 2023 planned already and super excited about it. So stay tuned for that. And until then, thank you so much for helping us build a safer financial system. Really, really appreciate it. And have a great day, everybody.